Is Black business prospering? Are we reaching women and minority-owned businesses? How do we achieve earning parity for wealth for our families? Do our children really have access to education? Will our families have choices for our children? Prison pipelines, mass incarceration, tearing our families apart. A healthcare system not accessible to the masses. The disproportionate termination of Black women from corporate America. When will we actually begin to address what's really at play? How do Black people gain more power to help make these changes? This requires a lot of political will and courage. I'm that provocateur of change. I am Cindi Bright. Welcome to HeartBeat. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to HeartBeat here on Converge Media. I am Cindi Bright, your host this evening. We have a great show planned this evening as we're going to continue our conversations on racial equity and progress for Brown and Black people. Before we start the show, before I introduce in the guests, I've got this 5-minute humanitarian award video I want to show you because I want you to pay attention to the words that Jesse Williams is using in here because we're going to unpack that and talk about how that is still relevant today. So have a listen to this and then I will introduce in our guests this evening.
For his continued efforts and steadfast commitment to furthering social change, we are proud to present such a deserving recipient with the 2016 BET Humanitarian Award presented by State Farm, Jesse Williams.
Peace, peace. Thank you, Deborah. Thank you, BET. Thank you, Nate Parker, Harry, and Debbie Allen for participating in that. Before we get into it, I just want to say, I brought my parents out tonight. I just want to thank them for being here, for teaching me to focus on comprehension over career, that they make sure I learn what the schools were afraid to teach us, and also to thank my amazing wife for changing my life. Now, this award, this is not for me. This is for the real organizers all over the country, the activists, the civil rights attorneys, the struggling parents, the families, the teachers, the students that are realizing that a system built to divide and impoverish and destroy us cannot stand if we do. All right? It's kind of basic mathematics. The more we learn about who we are and how we got here, the more we will mobilize. Now, this is also in particular for the Black women, in particular, who have spent their lifetimes dedicated to nurturing everyone before themselves. We can and will do better for you. Now, what we've been doing is looking at the data, and we know that police somehow manage to de-escalate, disarm, and not kill white people every day. So what's going to happen is we are going to have equal rights and justice in our own country, or we will restructure their function and ours. Now, I got more, y'all. Yesterday would have been young Tamir Rice's 14th birthday. So I don't want to hear any more about how far we've come when paid public servants can pull a drive-by on a 12-year-old playing alone in a park in broad daylight, killing him on television, and then going home to make a sandwich. Tell Rakia Boyd how it's so much better to live in 2012 than it is to live in 1612 or 1712. Tell that to Eric Garner. Tell that to Sandra Bland. Tell that to Dorian Hunt. Now, the thing is, though, all of us in here getting money, that alone isn't going to stop this. All right? Now, dedicating our lives to getting money just to give it right back for someone's brand on our body, when we spent centuries praying with brands on our bodies, and now we pray to get paid for brands on our bodies. There has been no war that we have not fought and died on the front lines of. There has been no job we haven't done. There's no tax they haven't levied against us, and we've paid all of them. But freedom is somehow always conditional here. You're free, they keep telling us. But she would have been alive if she hadn't acted so free. Now, freedom is always coming in the hereafter. But you know what, though? The hereafter is a hustle. We want it now. And let's get a couple things straight. Just a little side note. The burden of the brutalized is not to comfort the bystander. That's not our job, all right? Stop with all that. If you have a critique for the resistance, for our resistance, then you better have an established record of critique of our oppression. If you have no interest in equal rights for black people, then do not make suggestions to those who do. Sit down. We've been floating this country on credit for centuries, yo. And we're done watching and waiting while this invention called whiteness uses and abuses us, burying black people out of sight and out of mind while extracting our culture, our dollars, our entertainment like oil, black gold, ghettoizing and demeaning our creations, then stealing them, gentrifying our genius, and then trying us on like costumes before discarding our bodies like rinds of strange fruit. The thing is that just because we're magic doesn't mean we're not real. Thank you.
I needed you to hear that tonight. I have periodically shared that video because of how powerful it is to hear how he's describing the current state in 2023, even though that was in 2016, of where we are as Black Americans. Let me introduce in our esteemed guest tonight. He's a friend of mine, so when you see me, the warm smile on my face, I want to introduce Effenus Henderson in. Effenus and I worked together for 10 years, although he stayed a whole lot longer than me. Let me welcome in, and I'll let him introduce himself and his background because it's pretty impressive. Let's welcome Effenus Henderson on the HeartBeat. Effenus, welcome here this evening.
Well, thank you, and thank you, Cindi, for inviting me. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here. For those of you who may not know much about me, I worked for the Weyerhaeuser Corporation for 40 years in a variety of HR roles. I come from North Carolina. I grew up on a farm. This one. I grew up on a farm with 11 siblings and a father who had to raise us after my mother passed from lupus. So I knew then what I wanted to do as I became an adult, and that was to do something other than farming. And so that's what grounded my my interest in diversity and inclusion, because I came from a caring community where everyone in the community really helped each other out. They looked past each other's faults and frailties and said, if we're going to succeed, we've got to succeed together. It was a segregated community. I was there at a time when we were just integrating schools, and when the Klan and others would call our house and threatened to burn crosses in the yard and so forth. So it was a deep experience for me to realize that. And so when I graduated from college, I married my sweetheart, Helen. We both went to North Carolina Central University, and I started my professional career there. And so throughout my career at Weyerhaeuser, I continue to have a focus on diversity, even as an HR professional. And I retired as the chief diversity officer for the company, and one of the first in our company and in the industry for that matter. And so that's been part. I'll just pause there to see if Cindi has any questions, but I'll pause there just to share that part of my background.
You're also been heavily involved at the national level with Urban League issues, the Tacoma Urban League. You're on their board. You've been on for a hot minute there as well. You have longevity. You're able to manage it, Effenus. I got out. Yeah, you've been doing a lot. So I wanted to make sure our community knew who you were and what you're doing. And so, I showed the Jesse Williams video because I thought it was important to talk about the resistance, the restructuring of these issues or the systems that are impacting diversity progress. Can you talk about your own experience as a chief diversity officer and the resistance that you faced doing this work?
Well, I think one of the first things I'll tell you is that a lot of folks who say they're committed to diversity really don't fully understand what that means. We hear a lot. I wrote an article recently on LinkedIn called I'm Woke, Y'all, and it was a response to what we see as a lot of growing pushback to DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion work. And I said, we've got to do something. We really need to talk about this issue from a realistic point of view. Part of this work is about addressing inequities in the workplace, in our communities, and in society as a whole. And in order to do that, one of the biggest challenges was to get leaders on board with why this is important, starting with why are we doing this? Well, there are lots of reasons for it. It's looking at who the stakeholders are in the communities in which we operate, from the community members who expect organizations to be much more inclusive, from customers who expect you to have a workforce that represents them, to the employees that you're seeking to hire. They want to look at organizations that have a climate for this type of work. Many organizations saw this effort in the way that we saw it in the 70s and 80s as just a compliance issue. Diversity isn't just a compliance issue, it's a strategic imperative for organizations who are committed to this work, because what we're seeing now in a lot of the reports from McKinsey, from Catalyst, from Ernst & Young and others, is that the organizations that do value diversity, who really focus on changing systems, practices, and processes and behavior of leaders to be more inclusive, they generally outperform those who don't. So there is a reason for that, but there are those that don't understand, and you've got to figure out a way to engage them, help them understand the imperative for why this work is important, and really assist in changing those systems and practices that are inherently biased and create a disparate impact in the communities or for underrepresented and marginalized communities.
Mm-hmm. And you stuck with it for a long time. What's going through me as you're describing all this is the corporate description or the corporate way that organizations try to engage in this work. What has inherently happened, and not necessarily at Weyerhaeuser, because we talked earlier before the show, how many of you guys stayed for a long time? 30, you were there 40 years.
40 years, yes.
So unheard of, I think, in a lot of businesses and organizations that people stayed that long, and particularly people who come into the roles as chief diversity officers or chief equity officers. What's your observation of other DEI leadership people in roles and what their experiences are in organizations?
But what's really surprising these days, we're seeing reports where the average lifespan for a chief diversity officer is like 2.5 years. So people don't stay. And whether the question is, why is that occurring? Is it because the environment, the work experience of the work environment is so toxic, or leadership is not as committed, and they're trying to shoulder a lot of what needs to happen without engaging and involving more of the broader population in that organization? But it is an area where people think of it as the kinds of things like having a holiday celebration, or for a particular demographic group like Black History Month, or even Pride Month and things like that, as opposed to looking deeply at what needs to change in the organization. If you're truly committed to having a workforce that embraces everyone, where are you today? Where are the gaps? in what's your action. You have to have a fairly intentional strategy for addressing those actions. And then you have to have some measures to tell you how well you're doing towards that objective. I served as the convener for a working group under ISO, the International Organization for Standardization. And the working group met for 5 years to help establish the first global standard for diversity and inclusion in the world through ISO. And fortunately, last year, that standard was adopted by ISO, and it becomes the first guidance standard for organizations to look at a much more systemic approach to addressing diversity, equity, and inclusion, from the work environment to the governance processes and systems to the HR systems and practices, but going beyond that to relationships with stakeholders, with suppliers, and the communities as well.
I just want to acknowledge Carol Lee Regis just made a comment about a Twilight Zone to see you and I on here together. Hi, Carol Lee.
Hello, Carol Lee.
So funny. So some of what you said in that, Effenus, when your observation around the life cycle of a chief diversity officer, the 2.5 years, I've said 2 years. It is between 2 and 2.5 years that most chief diversity officers are exited, and they are exited in ways that I'm just going to say are blaming them for a system that has been in the works for 404 years, and no one's bothered to deal with it. And then we're expected, or the chief diversity officers are expected, to turn it around in 2 years. The funding or lack thereof of resources put behind these efforts is significant. And in fact, today I was telling you earlier that I went to the Northwest Diversity Supplier Council meeting, and I was watching presentations this morning about the state of Black America here in Washington State, and the state of Black business and revenue coming into our businesses. And I'm not exaggerating when I say, when the presentation slides were up there, I felt like it was 1992, because it's identical to my early career days that we talked about. And the people on the graphs with the lowest numbers were still the Black people. Now here we are, 2023. The DEI is under attack across the country, the messaging, the things that are being said. And frankly, every consultant will tell you, every resource we had internal to organizations say the funding has dried up. There is no more investment into it. And yet we're still expected to fix things. Has that been do you observe that in some of the consulting work that you do?
Well, I think for the companies that really get it, that there still is ongoing work. There's no cookie cutter approach to solving the issue. It our folks in diversity and HR.
Yes. I think we're testing the sound. I think the sound is in issue
Okay.
right now. We're just checking on that. Sorry. Okay, to our audience there. You know, in the last 2 to 3 weeks, there have been several issues in the news regarding Black women. There was I'm going to not do it justice to quote the number. I want to say $336 million verdict for the Federal Express law, the Black woman against Federal Express. She had to sue for racial discrimination. There was Equinox, the gym, Black woman sued, 11.5 million. There was recently Kaiser Hospital had to settle 11.5 million. So the Black women in these organizations who are not necessarily chief diversity officers. Oh, and then let's not forget our recent Dr. Karen Johnson, who was in the news recently over, my word would be petty issues that the news reported out on. And so we continually get to see that the burden of trying to move these diversity efforts forward or equity issues are continuing to fall on the backs with lack of support or no support. And it is forcing Black people, Black women to have to go sue in order to be seen, heard, valued, that sort of thing. What are your thoughts about? I mean, you saw the local news about our chief equity officer and her termination. What thoughts or what occurred to you when you read what was going on?
Well, I think the first thing that occurred to me was, why did this occur, and what type of process did they use to get to the conclusion that they arrived at? Change in any organization is fairly challenging, and so part of it is, how do you bring together the right folks to help shape and drive the policy? And when you bring in people who are different, who bring different points of view, perspectives, and backgrounds and lived experiences that you don't fully understand, sometimes you jump to the wrong conclusion about that leader's capability, their strength. And so for me, I think it's really being empathetic. I mean, there's a lot of discussion these days about empathetic leadership, trying to fully understand what it takes, particularly, and that's where I think oftentimes people have a challenge when it's the first role of its type in an organization. People haven't seen that type of role. They haven't seen people in those types of positions pushing back, asking questions, expecting things to be done differently if you're going to affect change in the organization. And that becomes very uncomfortable. And if you don't have a leadership team that is equipped to be empathetic, who become uncomfortable, generally the response is to push back and to try to marginalize the individual. I don't know if that's the case in this situation, but oftentimes we see that, and it's particularly something that we see with underrepresented groups, and especially people of color, and especially African American women, as we've heard from Cindi.
Mm-hmm. Yes, you said it diplomatically about people haven't seen how this works. See, Effenus, you and I, we had 25 years ago, how many, long time ago, I was as sassy then as I am now. Is it that they haven't seen this role, or is it that they can't handle Black folks because they aren't around us? And so what they're doing is critiquing who we are, and they don't receive who we are. And one of the things you and I had talked about earlier was the fact that we are constantly walking on these eggshells, trying to say and communicate and do things that appeases them, but they won't take 2 minutes out to learn to pronounce Effenus, right? Like they want to know what your nickname is, or the effort is always on the backs of the people who are brought in to fix a system that they did not create. And so I wonder, do you think this is fixable?
Well, it has to be fixable. I mean, if we're going to survive as a society, right? I mean, and what I'm seeing now, and why I think there's a bit of tension, more tension than we've seen in prior years, is because in American society, people of color are beginning to become more of the majority. I mean, and they're bringing a variety of lived experiences and so forth. And up until 10, 15 years ago, You didn't have that level of diversity in organizations. And so there's an expectation that I want to bring my full self to work, irrespective of whether I'm Black, female, LGBTQ, all of that. And in many organizations, that has not been something that leaders have had to contend with in the organization as a whole. So for me, I think the issue is really helping people understand that it's not a choice. You can't be silent. You got to speak up when you observe and see injustices in the workplace. You've got to speak up about it, and you've got to provide an opportunity for someone who might bring a different point of view, different perspective, different approach, to not be fearful of that because it's different from what you might have done, but to embrace it and to try to understand and be sympathetic with different approaches.
You know, my biggest critique when I was internal was, and I think many Black women, is our communication styles. I'm candid. It's just who I am. It's how I speak. I speak the truth, and I go to the heart of matters without sugarcoating them, sweeping them under the rug, or dancing around it. Because that's the communication style in many companies is they talk around issues and never to the issues and don't want to deal with it. And when we become laser focused on speaking and telling the truth or pushing harder, that's when this whole performance management system starts to kick in for Black people, particularly Black women, because we are candid. And so we don't have we weren't raised like princesses. And I mean, we just come from a different world. And so what are your thoughts about, the Black women that are getting kicked to the curb? And there's a lot. I mean, the outreach I've received since Dr. J was on 2 weeks ago has been astounding. Like, people are, there's an uproar happening right now. It almost feels like there's a bubble that's about to burst because people are tired of watching what happens to leaders and those of us who are trying to change systems, right? And so what is it you think we should do as Black people, as Black women in these organizations to be able to succeed?
Well, first, I think it starts with raising the level of consciousness around the issue, right? And not to sugarcoat it or to push it under the rug. What I see is that we bring a variety of styles. I mean, styles are also, there's an intersection of the styles based on where you're from. So I grew up in the South. Some people grow up in the Northeast. Different styles. Seattle has been known for being Seattle nice, right? Being kind of passive aggressive and so forth.
Not kind of, really passive aggressive.
Really passive aggressive. So I think it's really starting with raising the level of consciousness about the way people communicate and talk that are not necessarily bad. They're just different, and to really seek out to understand those differences. And to not be offended or push back on those, or to make judgments about others because they come with a different style. Particularly people that have good backgrounds in the work that they're doing and so forth, to not let impressions of that individual just by their demeanor and their approach. The second part of it is really start to engage in conversations and to talk about impact and intent, in situations, so that people get coaching and feedback on what they may be doing wrong, both ways, not just to Black women, for example, but Black women to white leaders in the organizations. Just creating environments where you can have a conversation about these things so that people are clear on expectations, they're clear on relationships, and they're clear on that they can raise issues. They can feel like it's safe to talk about issues where they're feeling impacted more negatively than others. So I don't think there's a simple solution to it. I just think it starts with, one, helping people understand and raise the consciousness around the issues, but then also to engage in the conversations about it.
Before we take a commercial, we did get a question from the audience that says, can you name a corporation that you consider as a model for DEI?
No. Let me just say that I think corporations are human, and to ascribe a model of DEI for an organization, I don't think it's the right way to go about it. I think some organizations are good at recruiting. Some organizations are good at creating employee resource groups. I think some are good at integrating DEI into their strategic planning processes. I don't think there's anyone that's got it all right. I mean, on any given day in any corporation, you can go and talk to a group of people, Black women, Asian, LGBT representatives, and so forth, and you'll find that there are challenges, there are issues. So there's no perfect organization. It's really when you get leaders to become much more empathetic and inclusive in how they talk about this issue, how they invite conversation about this issue, and so forth. I think that's what I would say. I wouldn't name any organization that's got it all right. I don't.
We're going to take a quick commercial break. When we come back, we're going to talk about the leadership in the organization. So we're going to be back in a couple minutes.
Half that up in Saks, I favor Black businesses. Assuming I'm rooting for everybody that's Black. Yeah.
COVID-19 hurt my income, my health, and my family. We were about to lose our home when we heard we might be eligible for homeowner assistance funds from the government. We called 1-877-894-HOME, and a housing counselor stepped in. They talked to our lender and saved our home. Because falling on hard times does not have to mean losing your home. Federal funding details at washingtonhaf.org.
What's up, everybody? You know, me and Besa, my girl, we had to pull up to Market Street Shoes once again, y'all.
And you know, we do this every season. We have to get the new shoes, the new boots, and this time I even got a coat.
Yeah, no, you did walk in without a coat.
I really did.
I'm glad you found one. But their boots were on point.
Yes, the boots, the bags. I even grabbed a flannel.
Yeah, you did. You know, and I was able to get some hats and everything. I was really impressed.
And you know, I was impressed because, of course, I got those white boots that you guys see me wearing everywhere these days.
Yeah, no, I look at your white boots and I'm like, darn it, they only have one pair. Me and Besa wear the same size. Of course, every time we walk out with several bags in hand.
Several bags and sometimes even a backpack, you guys. Make sure you check out Market Street Shoes.
Yeah, please deck them out. Where they go, Besa?
Ooh, 2232 Northwest Market Street, Seattle, Washington.
One in every 500 African Americans in the U.S. suffers from sickle cell disease. 1 in 3 African American blood donors is a match for patients with sickle cell. 1 appointment to donate blood with the American Red Cross can help save a life. Will you be that one? Visit redcrossblood.org/ourblood today to schedule an appointment at a location near you.
Saks, I favor Black businesses. Assuming I'm rooting for everybody that's Black. Yeah.
Welcome back to HeartBeat. I am your host, Cindi Bright. This evening joining me is Effenus Henderson, the CEO of Henderworks, former Chief Diversity Officer for Weyerhaeuser Company, National Urban League, Tacoma Urban League, has done a lot in his career. We were talking before the break about some of the impact of the labor of being a chief diversity officer. And where I want to pick up now is to talk about what we should expect from leaders who are managing the chief diversity officer role. So my first question is, I've watched and seen how several of these chief diversity jobs are positioned inside of an organization. Some are put in HR, some are put directly to the CEO. Have you seen a successful model in terms of a chief diversity officer's ability to influence change? Do you feel when it's in HR, did you report into HR as a chief diversity officer?
I did,
Yeah,
yes.
You did. Okay. I couldn't remember. When I was there, Weyerhaeuser was 55,000 people. So a very large company. What's your thoughts about that nowadays, about reporting relationships?
To me, the more important issue is, what is the organization trying to achieve with its DEI efforts? And that requires having a heart-to-heart conversation with the C-suite, the CEO and the leadership team. It's not acceptable just to expect that the CDO, whether they report in HR or directly to the CEO, can carry this. It requires a change in leadership to understand this is an important issue, and they've got to commit to it. They've got to spend the time talking about what they are doing individually and collectively as a leadership team to drive improvement in this area. They've got to understand the language. Oftentimes, I think the buzzwords around diversity, equity, and inclusion, people have misperceptions, for example, about what they are. And if your leaders don't fully understand that, then there is a certain expectation of the DEI professional, and it's not to be at that strategic, systemic level. And that's where oftentimes the rub comes in. You know, even in HR, if your DEI professional is reporting to the chief HR officer, if that officer doesn't fully understand or still has a compliance or legal frame for how they think about the work, then it sort of marginalizes that person inside the organization. So I think the first thing that an effective professional in DEI should do is to have the conversation with the leadership, the CEO, to talk about why is this important for us, give them data and information about best practices, about what others are doing and how it's helped to achieve successful results, but to then get them to declare what their commitment level is and what the organization's commitment level is. Now, a number of organizations have done that in the last few years, but there has not been any follow through. To your point earlier about having a person with the appropriate level of resourcing, the kinds of staffing that's oftentimes needed, and the types of changes they need to make in terms of their personal expectations about what they want leadership in the company, not just them, but leaders throughout the organization in terms of respectful behavior, creating a safe place for people to have courageous conversations and so forth. All of this is part of it. There's no one right solution to it. But I would say that if you don't get leaders to talk about it and to fully commit and to actually role model and communicate that and hold people accountable, it makes it harder for that CDO to be successful.
One of the shifts that happened post George Floyd was that the DEI function added another letter to it, which was J. So it was DEIJ for justice. Mm-hmm. And when justice started, you know, the workforce demanded that justice start to be handled by these organizations. And they did make some statements in 2020 that they were going to seek justice, social justice. Have you seen that? Have you seen any organizations besides, you know, I'll give a shout out to, I think Ben & Jerry's, not based here. Ben & Jerry's is an organization that actually says what they mean what they say, because I've watched a lot of their branding and so forth. And I think from my perspective, maybe the employees wouldn't agree with it, but the visible company here in the Northwest that seems to be demonstrating that from my perspective is Nordstrom. I was shocked at that, but they seem to have they've really made a change and pivot with who they're showing on their ads. And they've really I've noticed a difference. I haven't seen it anywhere else. Have you noticed any justice being served or?
Well, again, it depends on the context, the company, the environment, their customers, and so forth. I would agree. Nordstrom in this area is a firm that's done a lot of progressive work. There are others, but I think it's an ongoing struggle. You know, one day you may be doing very well, but the next day you'll discover, oh, what happened to their DEI officer? They left, right? And so there's this whole regenerating of a lot of the work that should just be work that you've already done to move the needle forward. So it's wow. I can't even give you a straight answer for that. I'm thinking. I'm having to think about that.
Which speaks volumes to the question, right? Right. And one of the other issues, Effenus, is I'm kind of back to the Chief Diversity Officer reporting into Chief Human Resources, because my opinion about that is that it's disastrous, because the Chief Human Resources Officers are generally using gender as their measurement of diversity. And so what that means for Black women is that we're forced to work for women that don't understand justice and equity and what that means. And so I have watched a lot I've been out of corporate for a decade now, and many of the Black women I speak with describe the injustices that are happening to them by the function, the HR function, who's destroying their lives. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, getting back to the question of adding the J to it, the question is, what does that mean? What is justice for the organization? Is it racial justice? Is it social justice? Is it something more? I would agree. I think if you don't have a progressive or forward-thinking HR director to place the Chief Diversity Officer role underneath them, is really to marginalize the role. That's why I think you start with the conversation with the leadership of the organization and to ask the question, why is this important for us to take seriously in terms of this work? Most of the progressive organizations are now tying it back not only to their day-to-day practices, but to their strategic plans. They're looking at and it's going beyond, say, the workplace and the workforce to how do we think about our relationships with our customers, with our suppliers, with philanthropy and so forth, which would suggest to me that a more appropriate role would be a direct reporting relationship to the CEO, because in that way you can help manage and help guide the work, and you're not filtered through another level of leadership in the organization. I think this work it's even now becoming part of what's called ESG, environment, social, and governance kinds of activities as well. So it's broadening.
Filtered is a polite word. Because the word I would use is destroyed, right? Destructive. Yeah, just what's happening between that level and the next level. So yes, I agree that that person should have the ear and the influence of the chief executive. When there's a person in between, it's being filtered, is your word. And therefore you have to deal with some shift in the way things are handled. We said we were going to use that word today. What about the you'll know this term, the net hire ratio? Let's just talk about how many Black people you hire, how many people you bring into the organization versus how many are leaving the organization. And that is your net hire ratio, right? Does anybody still talk? I haven't been in a decade. So is that even a factor anymore? Because a lot of the companies used to just try to take credit to check the boxes, but they can't sustain the folks inside. And what's the average life cycle of a Black woman? It's 2 years. And so what are your...
Well, let's start with the outcome.
Okay.
So if you've got your leaders talking about workforce composition, let's say as an outcome, let's say if the leaders talk about, we want to be an organization that has a workforce that represents the communities and the diversity of the communities, racial, ethnic, gender, all of those things, then you have to say, okay, so where are we today, right, in terms of that composition? And where are the most significant gaps in representation? And then you've got three factors in my mind that come into consideration. You'll appreciate this is placements against opportunities in those areas where you have significant underutilization. So for example, if you don't have Black women at all in the organization and you want to represent, and Black women represent a larger percentage of the workforce overall in the communities, then that would tell you that you ought to have a more aggressive strategies of outreach to Black women and bringing them into the organization, but not just bringing them in or recruiting them, but what are the developmental strategies in terms of career growth and development? Are they on the succession list? Are they on developmental programs and so forth? Are they being mentored by those? Are they being sponsored? You hear a lot of talk about the concept of sponsoring. And then on a year-to-year basis, to your point about the net, it's what's the turnover rate? You're hiring, particularly in those areas of underutilization, but they're leaving at a higher clip. So the question becomes, why is that happening? And what types of processes do you have in place to address that? Do you do surveys to find out whether or not people are leaving because of their experience in the organization?
A question came in for you, Effenus. What would you consider your most significant impact at the areas of diversity at Weyerhaeuser? Perhaps something you would consider your legacy?
Well,
who asked that? Oh, it is Carol Lee. I was like, let me look up and see who asked that question.
Well, I think part of the legacy, and I don't attribute it to myself, but I attribute it to a team of people, including one of my my mentors and your mentors, Bill Mackey, who was a champion and really was someone who championed the work. And he championed it not by just words, but by his actions in terms of support, development, and growth. And so if I were to say anything, I would say it isn't about me, but it's about how is the organization responding and how are the leaders progressing and growing. I think you have to meet people where they are. And coming out of the forest products industry in the 1990s and early 2000s, it was a different industry, a very different industry. And it had a lot of different things going on at the same time. That's why you have to also look at context, what's going on in an organization, because as you know, a lot of organizational changes, restructuring, purchases of businesses, downsizing, shuttering of businesses. So all of those come into play. So it's not a simple answer. I would say, though, that one of the legacies up until it shifted at the time you and I left the firm was some of the things that we did to celebrate and bring attention to this through the annual observance, the Martin Luther King observance, where we actually would invite the CEO and leaders to come and speak about the issue. And by being in front of an audience, it requires a leader to think and to lean into uncomfortable conversations. And for me, I think part of the growth at Weyerhaeuser was at that time getting leaders who could lean into it a little bit more.
You and I were very, very fortunate to work for Bill Mackey. And I want to talk about him for a minute. I actually was sharing with you before the show started that Bill, I think most people know Bill passed away many years ago, but his wife Barbara just passed away recently. And so that family, Bill and Barbara, I can't say enough good things about Bill, but I want to highlight some of his characteristics that he had that I feel, from all my experience that I've been in 3 major companies here, I've been out on my own, and for a white man to take me under his wings the way that he did, and he helped me more than I can ever explain with how he coached and helped me and how he removed obstacles out of my way and how he advocated and championed for me. And he wasn't threatened or, he didn't play games with people. Who he was with me was who he was with you. And I don't feel like there's a good supply of those type of leaders anymore. Now, I'm not internal anymore, but I can base on what I'm hearing, particularly Black women, because those are the women that come to me a lot. They don't have that kind of support. And if they do, it's for a short term, and it only takes the whimper of somebody else to change the trajectory of that woman who's being mentored to throw their development into a whole spiral. I remember you said to me, you probably don't even remember you said this to me. We were in, I don't remember the meeting, but someone was speaking out about something, and you raised your hand and you said, I would be careful about that because I have watched when people say or do that, it'll come back to bite them in another way. And you were referring to their performance system because that's the vehicle that is used to take out our careers. This is a long-winded way of saying, from a leadership perspective, what do you think are the characteristics of what an effective leader, particularly for Black people, to be able to work for and with?
Well, I have to say that for me, I think it's an inclusive leader. One of the things that we did at Weyerhaeuser, we actually asked the workforce what are the attributes of an inclusive leader as part of a leadership development series that we did. And there were 4 characteristics that came to mind. One is this issue of trust, that if you are, to your point, what Bill said to you, he would say to me, and there was no variance in that. It was the same clear, direct message and so forth. So, and that helped to engender trust, that I felt comfortable, I felt safe, that he could basically, that he was supported me in a positive way.
Empathetic.
He was
very
empathetic. Yeah.
Yeah.
The second is expanding circles of influence. Oftentimes we see people who are situated in positions of power just really rallying around people who are similar to them, that, he went to Stanford or he went to Harvard or the University of Washington, whatever school it is. And it was those people who generally got favor. And there wasn't the ability to look at people that may have come from another university, particularly HBCUs, right? Because there was a perspective that wasn't grounded in fact, that those individuals could not perform or be as successful as those that were at those prestigious schools and so forth. Third area is this whole idea of providing equal opportunity for growth and development. So that Bill, for example, was casting a wider net. He says, if we're serious about diversity and inclusion, let's make sure that those people that are being developed, are very diverse. It's not just one model of a successful candidate. And I think he did that. And then the other part of it is just communicating, talking about it. If you see instances where people are mistreated or something is not said that's based on facts, to challenge that. I call it planting the seeds of doubt, particularly among marginalized communities. Well, Cindi is good, but kind of, or Effenus is good, but did you see that about him? Which is I call it casting aspersions and so forth. And so we have to be careful about that and challenge people when they do that and say that in organizations, because those become seeds of doubt and they build on each other. And so we have to be, as inclusive and empathetic leaders, really be willing to lean in, to understand, to listen. You may not understand a person's experience, but to be there, to say, I'm here. I don't understand what you're going through, but is there anything I can do? Doing those kinds of things are the kinds of things that engender trust and a feeling of belonging and a feeling of fairness in an organization.
Bill used to ask, I'll never forget this. He used to ask, what do you need of me? Like, what do you need me to do? How can I help you? And when the whispers, to your point about the back circle of creating seeds of doubt about people would happen, Bill would address that head on. He wouldn't bite and automatically believe that because somebody raised an issue. And I'm just bringing that back up now because I have watched how when Black leaders are exited, I'll just use the term exited, what is held against them can be very petty feedback or comments that people say about them that really have, I don't want to say no bearing, but the person who's put in that seat of power, particularly in these equity and diversity jobs, is in kind of a no-win situation no matter which direction he or she goes. They're pushing an envelope uphill. And so if you think about equity, the kind of support that's needed in those roles are far greater than what the average person gets in their career, the coaching, mentoring, tackling, blocking. Do you see organizations that provide that kind of resource? And before you answer that question, I'm going to say that, we look at their websites often, and you can judge whether a company is actually progressing their leadership by their pages, their home pages, their leadership teams. You can see it. And so I ain't seen a lot of change at the leadership level. So that implies that the succession plans and the coaching and development is only getting people to a certain level. Thoughts?
Yeah, I think you're right. And part of the challenge is we put too much emphasis on individual leaders as opposed to the system, right? And how that system impacts the lived experience, the feelings of inclusion, and a sense of belonging of folks that are in the organization. And what I do know that as a person of color, as African-American male, that we are highly sensitive people, sensing people, in terms of it's not just how you're talking to me one-on-one, it's how I'm observing you in other interactions with others and so forth. And we can tell when something's not going right or not
we
correct.
Can sniff stuff.
We can sniff stuff out
a mile away. Yes.
So whereas European or white employees generally, and I don't want to stereotype, don't have as well-defined sensing skills. And so things that we pick up on, they oftentimes don't see. And so that's part of the reason why having the conversations, having the discussions, really inviting people to share their lived experiences helps people to become more cognizant, right, of those things, because it doesn't come naturally for a lot of folks.
And to that point about, the folks who can't pick up on the cues that we, as we're sitting on the 14th floor, we can smell it coming in on the entry level, right? Like that, but what happens is that the undercurrent of people who are accustomed to being pleased continue to want us or diverse leaders to please all of them, and that's not possible to do. And so and they not only don't have sensing and those kind of skills, but the behaviors that are exhibited towards the Black leadership can be pretty atrocious, and executive leaders don't like to touch that kind of stuff. They don't want to get involved in that. And so I don't know, I've just kind of watched a pattern of let's just change the reporting relationship, or just like get it out of my hair because I don't want to think about it or deal with it. Would you agree that work needs to be done on, for lack of a better word, the accusers versus the accused?
Well, I want to start by saying that leaders don't want to touch that question there. I think that's very old school thinking. Leaders have got to start to lean into those very difficult conversations because they set the tone, they reinforce the behavior, and they allow things to exist if it isn't called to their attention. And they can't be silent about it, because silence to us is a sign of disrespect or a sign of exclusion or marginalization. So I think you really do have to help leaders understand that they've got to talk about this, communicate, and set expectations, much like what we saw in Bill, because people aren't going to tolerate. When I first came into the workforce, it was a different era. And people were really excited just to get a job in corporate America, right? Today, people have, particularly high talent, people from diverse communities have all kinds of options. And they're not going to sit around and wait for you to change. They expect to see that on day one. And to the degree they begin to notice and witness and seeing that, the likelihood of them staying around is going to increase. Right. You talk about this great resignation thing a couple of years ago. I mean, part of it was because of the clash of expectations, the clash of traditional practices and ways of doing things with the new way that younger professionals, much more diverse, who are experienced at working in multiracial, multicultural organizations, just took for granted in terms of this is the way it should be. And so organizations have got to pay much more attention to that.
And they come from multicultural families.
Families, exactly.
And so when you're in a family that's diverse and then you come into these environments that are not, it's like running into a brick wall. Like, it's a lot.
Well, the other thing, just one other point before I forget it, is that so there's an accountability, there's an expectation that oftentimes people of color, Black women, Black men, should be more assertive in raising their hand about opportunities and promotion and engagement in things that will help advance them. But I would argue that it's also incumbent on the leadership team to be much more of let me pull you in, let me invite you to participate in this, and to think of ways, particularly if you've got task forces, if you've got project assignments that aren't very diverse, to really understand why some of the people of color aren't on those, and to be much more intentional about encouraging and inviting people to participate in those venues.
And an extension of that sentence about the leader bringing them forward, the biggest role that leader must play once that person is forward is to back them.
It's to back them.
It's to back them. And as soon as you don't back them, even though you may not understand or agree with it, you've set that person up to fail.
Right.
And you've opened Pandora's box for complaints to come in and all the things that people don't want to see be successful. Effenus, I told you it was going to be a quick hour. It's a quick hour. Thank you for coming on with me this evening. And to our audience, I'm keeping these conversations live because it's the fight across this country now to continue to portray Brown and Black America as inferior, to try to take this DEI work away and believe that it's not necessary. It is absolutely necessary now more than ever as we enter another nasty political season. Thank you all for joining me this evening. Thank you, Effenus, for being on. We look forward to seeing you next week.
Half that up in sacks, I favor Black businesses. Assuming I'm rooting for everybody that's Black. Yeah.